Dr. Larry Dossey, who has been on the path of helping to, I'm going to put it this way, upgrade the thinking in medicine and life in general, the itself and how it affects our lives, our health, our bodies. This book is one of, you could say, books on prayer, on healing words, on the use of language, the interface of language with human consciousness. And he's so much in this direction of helping upgrade and change the conversation in the and beyond, so that we owe him a great debt for the work for quite some time and pioneering against all odds, which has not been easy, but progress being.
We are making Mitchell, I'm happy to say.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you here. Thanks. Speaking to medical schools, you told me recently on the radio the other day that you lectured Harvard Medical School not that long ago, and there was actually receptivity to the idea of not just healing words and prayer, but even premonitions. Could you tell us about that?
That's right. Actually, when I wrote the book in 1993 called Healing Words, which looked at the experimental data suggesting that our thoughts and intentions can make a difference at a distance, this was a revelation to almost all physicians. Actually, it was a stunning shock to me. I didn't know that evidence existed before I began to explore it. But I did, wrote about it, and it had a tremendous influence on the way medical schools viewed the notion that consciousness might be able to do something out there in the world.
Yes.
And so at that time, most medical schools wanted nothing to do with this. There were only 3 of the nation's 125 medical schools at that time that had any coursework looking at this. Now there are over 90 medical schools that feature this information in formal places in the curriculum.
Really?
So
within 20 years.
Yes. It really is a landmark development.
Yes.
I mean, who would have predicted this kind of openness?
That's right.
I didn't. So I'm hoping that this evidence favoring premonitions will have a similar influence in helping physicians wake up in a similar direction. Because when you think of it, prayer, intentions, and premonitions really are quite related.
Oh, indeed.
Because they look at the ability of consciousness to acquire and impart information out there into the world, beyond the body, beyond the present. And so this all fits into in my judgment, a consistent pattern.
They're like leaves on the same tree, Larry, and I would say that that tree is actually our nervous system, which is conductive the scientific data. And that's one of the things that's actually so impressive about your work, all of the work, that you bring forth rigorous studies, so-called double-blind studies and the like. I say so-called because I think people who feel they need those are often blind, because they have cut out common sense, and so they need other things and don't realize some of the limitations of that kind of inquiry, just by definition.
Well, that's a very good point, and I think we should emphasize it. You know, the great healers and spiritual teachers around the world through the centuries and even those who exist today, aren't holding their breath waiting for the outcome of the next double-blind randomized study. They know this.
Exactly.
And they don't need to hold it hostage to what the latest study shows.
Exactly.
But the fact remains that, like it or not, science is a hugely powerful factor in our culture. And if we can point to scientific evidence favoring this perennial, eternal point of view, this way of knowing, I think we're going to be better off as a culture if we can do that.
Yeah.
Because it's unfortunate, but it's true that a lot of people who wind up adoring science think that they have to schizophrenically separate the 2 modes of being. They have to put their analysis and reason over in one corner and their intuition and their inner knowing over in another, and they can't see how they can get them together. I think we can get them together.
I do too. Well, I think a lot of your work has really pointed in that direction very much, of really increasing the love, affinity, if you will, between science and religion, science and spirituality, medicine, and it's going to sound funny, medicine and science. We tend to think of those as synonymous, but what I have learned, they are not. Medicine lives in its own little clinical bubble, and it's largely separated from the science at hand. Look at quantum physics.
Of course.
It's not in there at all.
No.
Even more Newtonian, they have not actually digested, no pun intended, the ideas that underlie their own practices.
No, that's true. If I could just give you one example of the integration of premonitions, this non-local way of knowing things, and conventional medicine. When I was in medical school, I had 3 or 4 professors who were so good at just knowing diagnoses that I was baffled. I could not rationally figure out how they got from point A to point B and made a diagnosis. So the logic didn't seem to explain it. So one day I went up to one of them and I said, "How did you know that?" And he looked at me with a look of irritation, that was pushing him a little too far.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, it's just experience." And I thought, boy, that really helps a lot.
Yeah, right.
And he said, "After you've done this a while, you just know." And I thought, now that's interesting. What if you unpack that, what does that mean,
right.
just know? He could not explain to me rationally and analytically how he reasoned from this set of data to a diagnosis. And he was irritated. And I asked 2 or 3 other professors who had this uncanny ability to make diagnoses. They all said the same thing. It was basically, go away, don't bother me.
Wow.
And
Yep,
I think
pushing
they
those
were
buttons.
Yes, they were invoking this premonitory ability, this way of knowing what the diagnosis was going to turn out to be, and they were seeing it, and they couldn't explain it.
Right.
I think many great physicians have this ability and can't own it.
Exactly. They won't speak the language that it kind of reflects.
Yes.
No, I know what you mean. I think it's really true. It's interesting. So when we pierce something with our focus, with our attention, very wholeheartedly, we get results. There's some magic that happens in the field that reveals itself to us in ways. So it begs the question, how do we know what we know? And what is knowing? So what is it?
Well, I think that if one takes a step forward into this dimension and opens up, the universe sort of takes a step toward you and sort of meets you halfway. And in that interaction, there's a kind of certainty. You know when you know. Now, I don't think we can reduce that place of knowing to logic. It seems to be more adaptable to art and poetry and music than language. But there's no question in my mind that all great healers know that place.
Exactly.
What we need to do is to make this, we need to present this in a way that it's accessible to young students coming on board. I've had a lot of interchange with students. I have a file in my office I call the letter. It's where I keep all the letters I get over the years from students, medical students.
Really? Yes. And what do they say?
They're almost all alike.
Really?
They say, "I can't stand this analytical, logical emphasis. I know there's more. I feel there's more.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions?" Some of them are desperate, Mitchell. They'll say, "If you could name me a medical school, I will try to transfer to it if they present this larger notion of how consciousness enters into healing." So this has been a consistent plea from students over the years.
Well, you're opening up that door right in person to them, Larry, and through your books, for them to start that inquiry, because they knew what they were signing up for when they went.
That's right.
They agreed to a left brain only
They bought
system.
into it. Yep.
They bought into it. And that is a problem. And it's curious because medicine knows and science knows that we do have 2 halves to our brain, and one has an emphasis on its analytical function, and the other one on its spatial, gestaltic, intuitive function. And why is it thought that good medicine would only be based on 1/2 of our potential consciousness?
Well, these kids figure this out in the course of their medical education.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing how professors can maintain a denial of this. I mean, even if you look at known data, you get to the place where you have to make a role for meaning and purpose and emotions and intentions. I'll give you one example.
Please.
There is a research subject that was very popular back in the 80s and 90s called the Black Monday syndrome. And this refers to the fact that more American men have a heart attack at 8 to 9 in the morning on Monday, at the time when we go back to work, right? Start the work week again, than at any other time in the week. So this has been called Black Monday syndrome. And the data shows, surveys show, that people who love their work are spared the Black Monday syndrome, whereas if people hate their job, they are at increased risk, even greater than if their cholesterol level is elevated, high blood pressure, smoking, and so on. This is one of the best predictors of cardiac disease in American men that has ever been discovered. What do you think about your job? This introduces the question of meaning. What does your job mean to you? And if that meaning is negative, it's a matter of life and death, really. These kids, these young doctors, medical students, figure this out. And they see no attention being paid to these kinds of factors, and they say, what gives here? You know, this is a partial education. There's more to this.
That's right. They got it. They intuited the truth. And this is good. This brings us into the right whole-brained kind of thinking, and helps to further the science in the direction of exploration of the parapsychological, which we, you know, I like to let people know, Larry, that this is just a function of the human brain, nervous system, and human consciousness that has just not been used. It's like not using one of our limbs, and then when it starts to work, we go, oh my God, you can do it, but others can't. But everyone has it. And there are cultures, indigenous cultures and others, that have been relying on this. And there's a whole survival aspect that you bring up in the book, and we touched upon the other night, and I'd factually like to touch upon it here, that the whole domain of premonition and intuition has complete survival value, which is you can be sure that the universal creator built it into the system for good reason. Could you just talk to that a little?
Sure. I think that...
And that, by the way, includes inside it the whole idea of non-locality. We call it non-local, but it's actually part of the local universe, if you will.
Actually, I think this is such a pervasive quality of human beings that we ought to do away with the para in this and stop calling it para. There's nothing para about it. I mean, this is just who we are. There is survival value in it, because so many of the premonitions that people have to do with impending threats to their health. There may be a health threat. There may be a knowing that I really need to go have a physical exam because, you know, although I can't find a breast lump, I know I have one. I have several stories in which that turned out to be true.
Can you give one?
Sure. A woman goes to her doctor and she said, I've got breast cancer. This is a true story. And she takes one finger and she says, it's right here. There's no lump. He can't feel anything. And so she badgers him into doing a mammogram, which he does. It's normal. And he says, well, we'll just take a wait and see approach this. She says, no, we won't. I demand a biopsy. And so she bullies this doctor into phoning a breast surgeon to do a biopsy. And the surgeon says, where am I going to biopsy? There's nothing to biopsy. And he says, biopsy where she points. So he does. And several days later, the pathologist phones the first doctor back and says, how did you find this? It's the most microscopic breast cancer I've ever seen. It wouldn't have caused symptoms. You couldn't feel it. How did you know? And to his credit, he says, I didn't know. She did. And he said, how? And the first doctor said, well, in a dream. So this is a typical, there are many of those kinds of things where people know with a premonitory dream that something needs to be done, and it's right here. These are not uncommon.
Not uncommon,
and
not at all. They just don't get much of the light of day.
We need to develop this talent, and we need to honor it because it does, as you say, have a survival value. And these things should not be taken lightly.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean they're all going to turn out to be true. Some of them are false alarms, but if you were designing a genetically endowed capacity, you would want it too sensitive. You know, that's better than not being sensitive enough.
Better to be super sensitive than insensitive altogether.
It's the lion in the bush that you don't see that does you in, not the one you think is there that isn't.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Totally. So how do we develop premonition potential, if you will, PP?
Well,
what do you show people, teach people in these medical schools and elsewhere?
Well, I am of the opinion that this is genetically endowed by now because it does have survival value, and it makes sense that it would be incorporated into our basic DNA structure.
Yes.
So the trick is to open up to that. I mean, how do you allow it to flourish?
Yes.
I think there are several ways to do that. One, if we just acknowledge that it's in us, this trait, that does a lot to help it manifest. If we just declare, I want to be open to this, that's the first step. I think beyond that, the best technique that people can develop is to develop a way to help make the unconscious conscious.
Yes.
You can call that getting quiet or sitting down, contemplating, or meditating. But
so you could say it's connecting to an alpha, if not a theta state.
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay.
Studies show that people who have a meditative practice in their life score highest in experiments designed to test the premonition skill. Meditation and skill and premonitions just go hand in hand. They're intimately related. Yeah. Another technique is to keep a dream diary. It just makes you more sensitive to what you dream and what you intuit during the daytime, and it just sensitizes you to the messages that come up from the unconscious that normally you just shut down.
So these are things that our audience could do to begin to cultivate that, and I guess then bringing in the intention of cultivating that particular sensitivity, that particular faculty, would even just add to one's ripening in this area.
I'm convinced that that's so. You know, I mentioned a moment ago, if you take a step in the direction of the universe, the universe meets you halfway. I think this is an example of that. Simply declaring that I want this to manifest in my life. I will not be hostile to it. I invite it. These things cannot be manipulated, but we sure as heck can set the stage for them.
Yes, indeed.
By inviting them into our lives.
You know, you bring to mind when you were talking about the dreams that you had earlier in your life and these others that you're referencing as premonitory. I was thinking and how science has held it at bay. It's very curious. I was just thinking about Niels Bohr. And the entire principle of his physics came from a dream.
Yeah.
Now, how come that isn't digested with everything else that's considered, linearly analytical?
Well, Mitchell, it's considered embarrassing.
That's right.
We know, scientists know this, that it's all a matter of solid reason, logic, and analysis.
What you really end up seeing, Larry, is that science is subject to as much social, political, and economic forces as the rest of society. It's not immune from those. In order to stay pure, it needs to be.
Well, that's exactly true. And if anybody out there doubts that politics and social pressures play a role in science, then why is it that the majority of physicists are involved in the weapons industry? I mean, this is a clear evidence that our politics and our social cultural outlook pushes science around. I don't know how anybody any longer could doubt that.
Give us, we're in our remaining moments, another example, if you would, of some of the most powerful science that you have identified that further corroborates the premonitory and intuitive aspect of our nature.
Yeah. Well, there is an online series of experiments that's run for about 5 years that Dr. Dean Radin has set up, and people can take these premonition tests at a website called gotpsi.org, GOTPSI.org. And what people do is to log on, and then there's a series of tests that you can take where you have to make a prediction about what this randomized computer program is going to do in the future. And so this has been done for years. The odds against chance are billions against one.
Billions.
And so we're talking billions against one.
Wow.
So this clearly shows that people do have this ability. You can't fake this, Mitchell. This is hard evidence that we have this and that most people have it to some degree. This is not just a few people scattered here and there who have this ability. This is widespread in the population.
I've got to ask you in our closing moments about prayer, because as you were suggesting all along, Larry, it inhabits the same domain. It's not separate, but your work in prayer has been so potent and helpful to so many, including me in the work I do as a therapist and involved in energy medicine. What is an experiment that you have come across in the thousands that you have reviewed that people can kind of walk away with?
Well, I think there's compelling evidence that when people assert their intentions to help somebody at a distance, whether you call that prayer or healing words or intentions or whatever.
So-called non-local consciousness.
I call it
projected.
The non-local insertion of information into the world. Nobody likes that phrase. But the study shows
it gets the message across.
It does. The study shows statistically that people who are on the receiving end of that, whether or not they know it's being offered, do better in clinical outcomes than people who don't receive this. You can show this not just in people, but also in animals. And this is so impressive.
Totally.
If it happens in plants and animals, you know it's not due to the placebo response, not due to positive thinking. As far as we know, plants don't think positively, although I wouldn't want to go too far with that.
That's right.
But the evidence is very solid that this makes a clinical difference.
That's incredible. It's just incredible. I really hope people get that and keep praying. Well, thank you so much for your good work.
Thanks, Mitchell.
I so appreciate it, and I know so many do.
Thanks.
Really making an
Thank
impact. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Remember that this book, The Power of Premonitions, is one of a number by Dr. Larry Dossey, and if you're not familiar with the work, certainly this is the time to become so. Thanks so much for joining us. Visit us at our website, www.abetterworld.net, and yours is?
Dossey.com.
Dossey.com. Very good. Come visit. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you all next week.